Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Fighting Mad, Resisting the End of Roe v. Wade. Edited by Krystale E. Littlejohn and Rickie Solinger. Read by Deanna Anthony. Introduction. Rickie Solinger and Krystale E. Littlejohn. In the summer of 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, its 1973 decision legalizing abortion nationwide. The new decision, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, has had predictably brutal and unequal impacts on the lives of people in the United States. In the first months following Dobbs, 13 states implemented total abortion bans. Several others implemented bans based on the period of gestation, and still others continue to squabble over intended bans in courts. The Supreme Court's ruling was a dramatic shock, but not exactly a surprise after 50 years of attacks on legal abortion and after former President Donald J. Trump's appointment of 3 anti-abortion justices explicitly for this purpose. Dobbs is a singular Supreme Court decision, but it reflects a long history of politicians and other elites treating reproductive capacity as the key site for addressing a variety of challenges facing the nation. This history makes the Dobbs decision a climatic marker in the continuous stream of legal, institutional, and cultural efforts across several centuries to control or regain control over people's reproductive bodies. In the early history of the United States, and continuing today, elites defined the nation's primary challenges as producing a labor force and controlling land, wealth, and national order to sustain the country as a white nation. This aim, over several centuries before the invention of dependable, self-administered contraception and national legalization of abortion, required the government at the outset to enact laws and policies, pursue military operations and labor practices, and organize everyday lived experience with the aim of shaping and controlling population growth and marking the destiny of newborns according to racial principles. We must look first at the institution of slavery, a system that was sustained and enlarged by the reproductive labor of Black people. At the same time, the reproductive labor of white women produced a free white population. Clearly, the system that prohibited enslaved Black women from the rights to choose sexual and reproductive partners, the rights to form and protect their families, and to parent their children, fundamentally built and defined the brutal system of enslavement. In marked, deliberate contrast, this system ennobled a narrative of the sexual and reproductive self-ownership of white women. Politicians and elites also aimed to produce a continent where public and private ownership of land and other natural resources was no longer under native stewardship. To achieve this aim, white settlers and national armies decimated native reproductive bodies and otherwise brutalized native communities. Immigration policies, too, centered and justified exclusions and inclusion to meet the goal of privileging white reproduction to build a white nation. In an effort to exclude Asian immigrants from the United States, for example, a series of laws in the 19th century allowed limited numbers of laboring Chinese men into the country until the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited all Chinese immigrants for 10 years, but excluded the wives of these men, thereby limiting the number of Chinese children, citizens, born in the United States. Later in the 20th century, laws and policies extended earlier population control strategies that associated whiteness and only whiteness with citizenship. New efforts continued to enforce racialized reproduction and introduced pseudo-scientific eugenical standards. For example, politicians and policymakers designed public policies to punish poor women of color who public authorities accused of having sex with a man, who got pregnant, or who had a child while receiving public subsistence allowances. Hospital policy supported the involuntary sterilization of poor white, African American, Native women, and Spanish-speaking women, targeting these groups as producing racially and culturally inferior children. The rules of social welfare agencies justified removing children from low-income households of color, especially when the head of the family was a woman who did not live with a man and was therefore defined as an illegitimate parent. Today, obstetric care, environmental policies, educational opportunities, child transfers, and many other resources and practices that impact pregnancy, parenthood, and bodily autonomy still target people based on their race and class. All of these laws, policies, and practices, together with pre-Roe, post-Roe, and post-Dobbs, lack of safe, legal, and accessible contraception and abortion, have extended and deepened harms many people have suffered over time based on their reproductive capacity. The historical record, as well as the experiences of people today, shows that when the state takes the right to control the bodies of individuals with reproductive capacity, the results severely undermine the dignity, safety, and possibilities for full citizenship status of their targets. When women did not have the right to abortion or the right to contraception, not coincidentally, they also lacked economic rights and other forms of personal independence. And, always, this dependency was harsher and more totalizing for people born poor and for people of color. As many of the essays in Fighting Mad point out, this harsher, totalizing lack of support for managing reproduction has persisted across time, before Roe v. Wade, after, and now, when the court has revoked Roe. Again, the Dobbs decision is another marker of the breadth and depth of hostility to reproductive outcomes and national social arrangements that challenge both white supremacy and male supremacy. This is the context in which we bring together the diverse voices whose work we share in Fighting Mad. In putting this volume together, we clarify the contours of the fight for reproductive justice unfolding across multiple dimensions of the struggle in the period immediately following the fall of Roe v. Wade. At this time of incredible volatility, misinformation, and confusion, we have been invigorated by the opportunity to create a resource, making sense of the rapid-fire set of events unfolding in the wake of Dobbs. The recriminalization of abortion in many states has ushered in heartache and constraint for those in need of abortion. But this period also shows us people fighting for reproductive freedom, mobilizing new strategies to help individuals live self-determined lives under the new legal regime. This book shows that resistance is alive. The contributions illustrate what it looks like when people are forced to live under unsound policies, and most important, we show what people are doing to protect abortion access on the ground. At its core, Fighting Mad is about what reproductive justice means and what it looks like to fight for it. This concept and political activist framework was developed by a group of Black women in 1994 to define the human rights and material conditions that individuals require to live safe, dignified, fully embodied lives, making decisions about whether to reproduce or not, and about having access to the resources they need to be a parent or not, with dignity and safety. The reproductive justice framework was developed with recognition that courts and public policy have long been instruments of oppression, weaponized to disproportionately harm people located at the axes of multiple marginalized identities. This has been true even when courts and policy seem to aim for empowerment. Fighting Mad begins in the context of this recognition, elucidating the ways that people have been denied reproductive justice even when Roe was the law of the land. Because Dobbs aims to fundamentally restructure the experience of sex, pregnancy, and parenthood in the United States by allowing states to criminalize reproductive autonomy, Fighting Mad focuses more tightly on the impacts of criminalized abortion than on other key facets of reproductive justice. In fact, Dobbs forces us to focus on the meaning and repercussions of this criminalization, the loss of the human right not to have a child, and on the uneven impacts of the court's ruling across society. Nevertheless, in various ways, the essays address the full nexus of core claims that constitute reproductive justice. Because Fighting Mad is devoted to highlighting on-the-ground work in communities and to following the reproductive justice perspective that acknowledges the law's limits in securing reproductive autonomy, we leave close analysis of the legal landscape in the aftermath of Dobbs to others. We want this book to serve as an artifact of this tumultuous period and as a record of the tremendous work people are doing in the crisis, in part so that this period is remembered and its accomplishments remain inspirational and foundational. Nevertheless, as a snapshot of an important historical moment, Fighting Mad is not a comprehensive survey of all forms of post-Dobbs activism, either activism in the interest of reproductive justice or in the interest of state control of reproduction. For example, as we write this introduction, the legal status of medication abortion is unsettled. In early 2023, after a federal judge in Amarillo, Texas, banned the distribution and use of medication abortion, or mifepristone, across the country, the U.S. Supreme Court blocked that ban, keeping mifepristone available in states where and when abortion is legal as the case proceeds through the courts. We cannot know the contours of resistance to that and other court decisions that will surely follow Dobbs. We do not at this point have a comprehensive understanding of how Dobbs will justify interference in various states with access to assisted reproductive technology procedures such as in vitro fertilization, or how many hospitals will curb OB/GYN services in the wake of Dobbs. Indeed, the impacts of Dobbs, strategic responses to the decision, and ensuing developments will continue to evolve over years. We have been heartened to bring together a group of change agents representing a remarkable breadth of energy and expertise, activists and artists, academics and abortion storytellers, religious leaders, healthcare professionals, legislators, and clinic directors. This volume has collected the voices of people working to facilitate abortion access and travel, fighting in courts to protect access to abortion and to protect people criminalized for having one, providing abortion care and support across the spectrum of client and patient needs, and so much more. Creating a platform to share all this work felt like both a service to listeners and therapeutic respite for ourselves. For just as we read story after story about tragedies unfolding in the news, we also hear essay after essay about how activists are standing fast in the face of reproductive tyranny to create better lives for themselves and others. As such, our methodology reflects the world that we live in. To find such a diverse range of contributors, we scoured the internet and looked for fresh names in news stories. We thought of people whom we knew were doing the work and built out from our networks to find contributors whom we did not know. We had conversations that sparked new ideas for a domain that we believed needed coverage. And we reached out wherever and whenever we could, recognizing that the people were busy doing the work that we so desperately wanted them to write about. We remain ever grateful that they obliged and that we can now share their voices. The perspectives gathered here reflect the enduring commitment of individuals, communities, and organizations responding to state violence, variously banding together on the ground to fight for one another while eyeing the courts to assess each new decision and to find opportunities to minimize harms and champion reproductive justice. Fighting Mad honors this work. The essays in this volume grapple with the urgent challenges we face in reclaiming the fundamental requirements of making and remaking human life, and they offer a promise that has been the hallmark of organizing for freedom. People facing oppression will always fight for self-determination. As one of our contributors, Koya White Hat Artichoker, writes, "Now that Roe has fallen, we have an opportunity to be bolder, dream bigger, and push at all points of resistance." This book offers a glimpse at how many people are doing just that. The contributors come from and work within many different traditions and contexts. In writing their pieces, the authors have chosen for themselves what words to use to describe history, lived experience, and this present moment. They have written in various voices, personal, scholarly, or hybrid, and document their essays accordingly. Part 1. Roe was never enough. Krystale E. Littlejohn. As Rickie Solinger and I put together this edited volume, we collectively mourned the fall of Roe v. Wade, while recognizing that many marginalized people never enjoyed its protections. Many suffered exclusion. How do we chart a just path forward that frees everyone to realize their human right to abortion if and when they need it? In the pieces in the first part of the book, educators, activists, researchers, and doctors join together to give voice to the experiences of exclusion, subjugation, oppression, and violation that have always existed alongside Roe. Their contributions offer powerful visions of reproductively just futures. Educator, writer, and facilitator Erica Iodeli Dixon opens with a wrenching account of how the state has long violated the right to self-determination for disabled, poor, queer, trans, immigrant, Black, and Indigenous people of color. Koya White Hat Artichoker, activist Ansi Chungu Lakota, follows with her own visionary statement detailing how community memory and knowledge make visible the brutality of sexist, misogynistic colonial structures, while simultaneously providing a framework for a better tomorrow. Following this is the powerful statement written by members of the Advisory Council of the Building the Fire Fund, condemning the Dobbs decision. This statement, together with White Hat Artichokers and Dixon's contributions, calls on us to ground our work in Indigenous reproductive justice and disability justice, to honor our collective survival as tied to all life, and to fight for all lives marginalized by eugenic logics. Work by Nomi Kane and the team at Plan C builds on these frameworks by demonstrating the transformative nature of art to raise awareness about abortion with pills as a crucial resource in the fight to self-manage abortion. As the comic and other essays in this volume highlight, people lacked access to abortion even with Roe, but abortion with pills offers a way to achieve reproductive autonomy for all. A heartening piece by doctoral fellow Haley V. McMahon follows, documenting the barriers that have long faced people seeking abortion access in Appalachia. McMahon showcases the power of community action and grassroots activism to challenge the structural barriers that anti-abortion politicians erected in the wake of Dobbs. Her essay shows that, come hell or high water, there will always be communities on the front lines fighting to get people the abortions that they need. Next, a poignant piece by researcher and abortion storyteller Sheila Desai highlights the harms of ignoring the abortion needs of Asian Americans and immigrants based on mythologies of exceptionalism. Desai issues an urgent call for us to eradicate racism and xenophobia to eliminate the hidden harms of exclusion. Researcher and obstetrician gynecologist Carolyn Sufrin closes this part of the book with testimony that indicts the prison industrial complex for the many violations that it inflicts on the humanity of incarcerated pregnant and birthing people. Sufrin explores how Roe had long failed in breathtaking ways for people facing incarceration and offers concrete strategies to alleviate these barriers in their fight for reproductive autonomy within the context of state-sanctioned subjugation. Together, these contributions offer a powerful call for reproductive justice for all to remedy the shortcomings of Roe as we fight for a better future. 1. Disability, Dobbs, and a Black Perspective. Erica Iodeli Dixon. The overturning of Roe v. Wade was yet another stark reminder for disabled, poor, queer, trans, immigrant, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that the state will never protect us. It was yet another reminder that the state has been set up to systematically control people like us, if not eliminate us altogether. The state's commitment to deny our dignity, safety, self-determination, and very existence has never been in question by those of us most at the margins, which is why, for so many of us, while heart-wrenching and terrifying, the Dobbs decision is not a surprise. The Supreme Court decision is but one piece of a project that highlights the eugenic logic of the state, its commitment to work toward controlling the population and eliminating undesired, that is, those who are not cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, wealthy male populations. There's a complicated history, particularly for Black disabled people, around abortion, the right to choose, and self-determination. The conversation moving forward about reproductive rights has to be broader than just talking about abortion. Indeed, to move forward in a post-Dobbs world, we have to dissect what self-determination means now for queer, trans, Black disabled people. The Dobbs decision derives from a legacy of eugenic practices in the United States, practices that specifically, ongoingly target Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, working class, poor, trans, queer, immigrant, and other multiply marginalized people, and that work to eliminate us. We must examine the eugenic piece, that is, the unscientific practice that works to eliminate undesired genetic traits from the general population and increase heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Without this analysis around the right to choose, the possibilities for self-determination, and our understanding of the impact of the Dobbs decision are incomplete. In the United States, eugenics became the basis of many state laws in the early 20th century. At that time, politicians, judges, policymakers, religious leaders, and much of the white public in general regarded eugenic reproduction as a justifiable moral obligation and a national project. The aim was to sterilize those deemed unfit to pass along good genes, including the disabled, institutionalized wards of the state, and incarcerated people, most of whom were poor and people of color. It is no secret that the country was founded on principles of population control, that leaders at all levels were devoted to the manipulation of genetics and breeding to create the concept of citizenry as composed of a white, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual male population, while using the brutalities of chattel slavery and the burgeoning economic system to establish complete control over enslaved Africans from the period of white settlement on. If we think about the pro-life, or more aptly, the anti-choice argument, that life begins at conception, we can clearly see a link between this claim and the reality that governed enslaved people of childbearing age. When they got pregnant, fetuses became the property of the enslaver, not the child of the biological parent, a fact that the eugenically minded pro-life movement has yet to grapple with. Indeed, the pro-life movement simultaneously exploits disabled people for the benefit of their anti-abortion movement, while advocating for disabled people to be eliminated from the population. For example, the anti-abortion movement invokes disabled babies and potentially disabled unborn fetuses as a reason for being against abortion. If every life is sacred, terminating a fetus because of disability or potential disability is unimaginable. However, they are using disabled people as a political pawn instead of seeing us in our full humanity and dignity. In fact, by actively advocating for the end to legal abortions, the anti-abortion movement is actively dehumanizing and endangering disabled people's lives, safety, and dignity. No individuals are more impacted by decreased self-determination than members of groups pushed to the margins of society. The state continued to intervene in the reproductive lives of the most marginalized people in the early 1900s. In fact, sterilization and elimination practices in the United States, particularly those enacted on the bodies of disabled people and people of color, influenced the German dictator Hitler. Drawing on U.S. practices, he instructed physicians to sterilize hospitalized disabled people against their will. Subsequently, hospital personnel followed orders to murder disabled people. When we focus solely on the criminalization of abortion and ignore the ways that reproductive health has been used as a platform to define purity or a healthy baby, and to codify and categorize disabled people as expendable and removable objects before birth, we do a disservice to the disabled, trans, queer, poor Black, Indigenous, people of color who have suffered centuries of reproductive violation. Carrie Buck, an institutionalized 17-year-old girl in Virginia, wrongly designated as intellectually subnormal, was grotesquely sterilized in the 1920s. In Buck v. Bell, 274 U.S. 200, 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Buck's sterilization and the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924. The decision validated the state's right to coercively sterilize people for the protection and health of the state, thereby officially legalizing eugenic sterilization in the United States. Sterilizations continue deep into the 21st century. Ashley X, a young disabled girl born in 1997, is a contemporary case in which reproductive justice activists and pro-choice activists alike missed an opportunity to support a young girl in a reproductive justice fight. Ashley X's parents decided when she was 10 years old, with the support of her physician, that they would give her hormone blockers to stop her from undergoing puberty, to keep her small-statured and immature, an act that would make her easier to manage as she got older. Ashley X had no advocates and did not understand what was happening to her body. Her case helps us understand that when we replace the consumerist slogan, "the right to choose," with the concept of self-determination, we can see that reproductive justice for disabled people demands we develop both clarity and certainty about the meanings of reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy. This involves fighting for disabled people to receive dignified health care disassociated from the ableist idea of cure, or based on the stigma that disabled people are asexual or can't understand their own sexuality. Disabled people, particularly disabled queer, trans, poor Black people, have long faced obstacles to choosing whether or not to have an abortion. They've also been disqualified from parenting their own children. In the 1950s and 1960s, birth control was being hailed as a miracle for the white middle-class woman who stood to gain educational, workforce, and family planning benefits. But Black and women of color families, especially those of childbearing age, bore the brunt of the enabling experimentation. At the same time, many were subjected by science and public policy to temporary and long-term sterilization. Poor Black families were also stripped of their ability to raise their children due to strictly imposed, harsh welfare policies that threatened to split up and incarcerate Black families over minor infractions. The eugenic history of the United States provides the foundation for understanding what we are fighting both for and against. This understanding is crucial for unifying our movements and achieving lasting self-determination, dignity, and affirmative reproductive health for everyone. As Angela Davis says, radical simply means grasping at the root. To radically transform society and move toward greater liberation, we must understand how we got here. Our disabled, trans, Black, queer, Indigenous ancestors have been fighting for centuries, and it is high time that we listen to them and their lessons. The question, not just for disabled, Black, queer, and trans, Indigenous, poor, immigrant people of color, but for all of us, is how do we build mechanisms for self-determination in a world that remains tethered to eugenic ideas, a world in which people with power continue to pursue elimination and control. First and foremost, we must listen to.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?